In this video, we're going to look at how to configure SQL Server support for PowerShell Universal. By default, we use LightDB to actually store job information and identities of users logging in, that kind of thing. But with version 3, you can actually store your data in a SQL Server, which means you could have multiple PowerShell Universal instances talking to that same SQL Server. So I'm going to walk through the Windows MSI installer here, and then I'll show you the app settings.json file that's produced after running this. And this works for Windows, obviously, but that app settings.json file is actually cross-platform. So you'll be able to see how you can actually configure it using a file similar to that. So I'm going to click Next, accept the EULA. I'm going to leave the port at port 5000. I'm going to leave my service account to run as local system. You could set a service account here that has access to your database. Just remember that whatever service account PowerShell Universal is running as, that is what is accessing your database. So if you're using a trusted connection, you have to ensure that that account has access to the database. I'll click Next, and this is where we actually configure our data settings, and some of those data settings are our persistent database type. So by default, we're set to LightDB, and I'm going to switch to Microsoft SQL Server. And then I will actually put my SQL Server connection in here. I'm just using a MS local DB here. My database is called PSU, and I'm using a trusted connection because I have Windows authentication enabled. In this configuration, what's going to happen is it's actually going to create an app settings.json file for me with the appropriate settings from this installer wizard, and then it's going to start the PowerShell Universal service to actually create the database and install the schema for PowerShell Universal. So we do have a SQL Server script that you can run if you do not have access to create schema via the installer or the service. So you can also do that, and you'll find that in the installation directory. So if you are having issues where you can't configure it this way, I would recommend setting it to LightDB, and then you'll see later in the video how the app settings.json file is set up, and you can actually configure that after the fact and just restart your service. So I'm going to click Next. We're just going to install to the default location, and then I will click Install. It's going to lay down the files for PowerShell Universal, and once those files are laid down, it's going to start the Universal service, and that will actually create the database and set up the schema for PowerShell Universal. When you're running the MSI again during an upgrade, you won't have to enter all that information I just entered, and it will actually just update the schema if there are new schema objects that need to be added to the database. So we're going to click Finish, and we're just going to go to PowerShell Universal, and what you'll see here is that it's just up and running. It's not going to be very obvious that you're running SQL. We have no real indication here that you're running SQL, but it's actually storing all your job data and your identities, for example, this admin identity, in the MS SQL database. So in another video, you'll be able to see that we have multi-instance configuration set up inside SQL Server, so that you can actually see that two different nodes are actually configured to actually talk to the SQL Server and store that job data in there. When we actually ran that setup, what it did is it actually created this program data folder here for PowerShell Universal, and you can see we have an app settings.json file here. Inside the app settings.json file, you'll find all these settings that we put inside the MSI. So this is where the port was configured, for example. If you wanted to add an HTTPS certificate and change the port to 443, this is where you would configure it. There is a plugin section. This actually swaps out the LightDB plugin for the PowerShell or the SQL Server plugin. And then finally, we have our connection string set here. And this is the actual connection string that is provided to PowerShell Universal to create the database and also access the database. In this case, I'm using a trusted connection, but you could also use username and password, which you may not be comfortable leaving in a file on your system. You can also use environment variables. We kind of have examples of that inside our documentation about how you can set these app settings with environment variables rather than a file, which is very useful for things like Azure Web Apps and that kind of thing. So again, this is kind of what you would create if you were installing this on a system that didn't have the MSI installer, like a Linux system or IIS, you would just take the same app settings.json settings and put them into the proper location, which again is on our documentation. By default for Windows, it's in C program data, PowerShell Universal app settings.json. You can also specify a command line argument to change where that app settings.json file is stored. So in this video, we kind of step through the basics of setting up PowerShell Universal to use Microsoft SQL Server.